Welcome. Today we're talking about why you feel responsible for everyone and how it actually starts. Do you ever feel like it's your job to manage everyone else's emotions, even when no one asked you to? If so, then this episode is for you. Today we're talking about why you feel responsible for everyone and how it starts. That didn't start with you. Let's talk about what that actually comes from. Welcome, baseball, DK. Welcome, Steve Dustin Harrington. Hey guys, welcome. Let's talk about where that actually comes from. Essentially, you likely have been taught that emotional responsibility does not equal kindness, right? That's what you've probably likely been taught. And oftentimes, this comes from parentification, which essentially is where a child is taught to develop and take care like a parent would of a child while they are still a child. That can be responsible for managing your mother or your father's emotions or your adult caregiver's emotions. It can be kind of taking care of yourself. I remember hearing a story about this child who the mother was really overwhelmed. So the child started developing these skills such as making their own breakfast, tucking themselves in at night, taking care of their siblings so that the mother wouldn't get overwhelmed. And ultimately, that is extremely unfair to children. I know I had a similar experience because I had a parental unit who had been through a lot of trauma and had never really advanced from that trauma. And so I oftentimes would be the person who would ask her, how she's feeling, like, how are things going? Are you doing okay? How is life treating you? And then at times it was almost like, as an only child, I was like a little adult, right? And so I had to try to learn and read her emotions and to figure out where she was at for the day. And I still remember being a kid and her, me wanting to ask her questions because I was very curious. And I would ask her questions that I didn't fully understand, weren't as nice. Not that I meant them to be mean, but I would always preface it with, promise you won't get mad, because this person I knew was kind of sensitive, And so it's also walking on eggshells, similar to, promise you won't get mad, and then the person promises. And then, of course, they do end up getting mad, and you as a kid don't really know how to handle those emotions. You don't know how to fend for yourself, so to speak, in that environment, in that arena. And it's extremely unfair to children because it almost puts them in like the caretaking role over an adult, which is never fair. I mean, we aren't equipped to do that. No, I was a child at that time. I was very little. So I think you don't learn things until you're much older, so to speak. And I was very young. I think I was probably 4 or 5 years old. But I did know that she was actually probably likely going to get mad, but I was hoping that she would keep her word when she said that she wouldn't. And when you have somebody who is oversensitive, and you're a child and you don't really understand, it can be extremely difficult. So I wasn't an adult at this time. I was a child. And also reading moods so that you know when to stay safe, right? Because you don't know if this person is going to be in a good mood or are they going to be in a bad mood. And if they're in a bad mood, what's going to happen? Are you going to be punished for something you didn't do? Are you going to be sent to bed early? Are you going to listen to this person cry and be upset because, they had a relationship fail? I mean, what exactly are you going to walk into? And then you ultimately get the idea that you're responsible for your parental unit rather than you're responsible, or your parental unit being responsible for you, which is sad, and it's hard. And that doesn't end. There's still that relationship and still that link where you feel like you don't want to disappoint that person. because as a child, you don't fully understand what you're actually doing. You just know that you're trying to bring them comfort. You're trying to bring them some semblance of just peace. But you instinctually know, especially as an intuitive child, a lot of children are wise beyond their years, have the instinct that they need to keep the person afloat. They need to keep them calm. They need to keep them steady. And that is a huge responsibility, especially for someone maybe with untreated mental illness, someone who's experienced trauma, someone who is volatile at times because they're in pain. You know, the other side of pain is anger and hurt, right? And so it can be really difficult to navigate those emotions, especially, you know, as a young child. But it's something that a lot of parents don't realize that they're doing because they are so down that they can't see beyond their own pain. And so it's really difficult for them to try to manage, you know, more things, you know, more frustrations, more, you know, patience and all of that. And then in the middle of that, you know, you have relationships that start and stop, start and stop, start and stop. And how it shows now as an adult, if you were parentified as a child, here's how it's going to show up for you. You're going to be over explaining. You're going to constantly feel the need to justify what you're doing, who you're being, right? That's what you're going to get. You're going to want to fix things. You're going to want to fix people. I had a phase where I went through wanting to save people. And that was generally people that I dated that I felt bad for. And I listened and believed everything that they said, which a lot of them are manipulators, obviously, which there's a lot of manipulators in the world sometimes. And you want to save, you want to protect, you want to keep people from experiencing what you experienced. And if I could have saved my parental unit, I definitely would have. But unfortunately, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? And I think deep down, like that person wanted to change, but at the same time, it's easier staying where you are, putting your head in the sand and just hoping, you know, that one day it'll just magically fix itself. But that's not how healing works, right? And so ultimately, when you see that, you see how much pain someone's in, and you know and you understand and you have compassion for the trauma that they've been through and the life experiences that have essentially left them cold. You know, I mean, that's what kind of spurs you on to be able to help other people and to be able to recognize certain things. And ultimately, I think that a lot of my language for trauma came from those experiences. And so they're not wasted. They're a part of who I am. And they're a part of why I want to be compassionate to people that are hurting, because you think about it, to go through all that trauma and not have the resources needed to be able to get past it can be extremely difficult, you know, and all it takes is someone caring, someone wanting to be in that scenario, someone wanting to just reach out. How are you doing today? You can tell me, you can talk to me, you can trust me, you know? And I think that people realize that, you know? The other thing is guilt when others are upset. For the longest time, I was actually enmeshed with my parental unit. And when they would get upset, like I would be extremely upset, extremely upset. And it was almost just this huge like pressure on me, like something was like on my chest because I knew that she was upset. And I didn't want to upset her because I knew her reactions are explosive and intense. And so that can be really hard to manage too. And it feels like you're failing that person. But the thing is, when you're a mother, you have to look out for your kids, you know? And when said parental unit gets upset, sometimes she does things that are very kind of immature, so to speak. And as a child who dealt with some of those things, they were very hard to take as a child, very hard to understand how an adult would be wanting to engage you in some sort of conflict. It just didn't make any sense. And then also, you learned to read the room before you learn to read yourself. And ultimately, that is both a gift in some ways and a curse in another way. Because people who are able to read rooms and have discernment and all of that, and have language for certain things that they should probably not have language for, have been through trauma and significant trauma. So you learned to read the room before you could read yourself. Can you imagine that? I mean, that's just crazy. In some ways, as I've said, it's a gift and it's a curse, right? Because you got it with real life, but then also that means that there was a cost to that, right? If you know the economics, the economics phrases, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Yep. Yeah, I have trauma education, and I was earned all of it, So you think about that. So let's reframe this. You learning to read, meaning you learning to read rooms and such, is what keeps you safe. It's an adaptive skill. A lot of people, and maybe they're far more blessed than I, didn't need that, right? There was no reason for them to use that. But the people that actually know what it is, they've used it. They know what it's about. Maybe they grew up with someone who was using alcohol or substances or any number of things, and they had to know when they had to leave the house to be safe. So this was adaptive. It's not a flaw, but now it can cost you, right? And it can cost you in overthinking. It can cost you in people pleasing. It can cost you perfectionism. I've actually done topics on how perfectionism is not a personality trait. It's actually a coping mechanism. And ultimately that can potentially come from being parentified, right? Because you literally have a scenario where you want to please your parental unit so that you don't run afoul of what's going on, right? And I want to say one last thing. I will say that you're not broken. This is something we can actually understand and work through here. So if you're interested in checking out my podcast, again, I have Recovering Perfectionism, Grace in Progress, which deals with, it's like a psychology channel. And then the second one is the True Crime channel, which is Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney. So I also do analysis of cases you've heard of, like Darley and Scott Peterson and Susan Smith and Casey Anthony, all those. So I think it is, in some ways, it is an adaptation for sure. Today we're talking about why you feel responsible for everyone and how it starts. Do you ever feel like it's your job to manage everyone else's emotions, even when no one asks you to? And that didn't start with you, right? Let's talk about where it actually comes from. Generally, emotional responsibility is not the same as kindness. Emotional responsibility is taking on others' emotions, feeling like you have to help them get through their emotions, maybe even being enmeshed in their emotions. And that generally happens in parent-child relationships. I know that for a period of time, I was actually enmeshed in my mother's emotions. And if she would get upset, I would get upset. And that started early childhood. And then slowly, through getting some assistance, I was able to learn that that is not something that I need to take on. I have 5 children of my own. I have a spouse. I have a life. I have things I have to take care of. And that is a lot, and she's grown. She's had time. Yes, she's had a lot of trauma, of course. And I feel terrible about that. But ultimately, I can't let her emotions affect me, because then that gets me into a spot that's not a fun spot to be in, right? And oftentimes this begins with parentification. If you were a child who was maybe wise beyond your years, or you were forced to be wise beyond your years, then essentially you are being the parent to your parent. And so you are managing your parents' emotions, you're managing their disappointments, you're managing their moods, and you essentially learn to read before you could actually read a book, right? So you learn to read moods, you learn to read what they said, what they didn't say. You learn to read like what they were thinking, what their attitude was going to be before it all happened. Maybe you started walking on eggshells at an early age. You figured out their tone of voice. You figured out maybe sometimes there's people that have different color, like their eyes change when they're in a certain mood. Just small things. Tone of voice, maybe where they're coming from as far as have they been crying lately? Have they been drinking more? Have they been, doing maladaptive behaviors more than they had in the past, right? So you're reading moods to stay safe, which you knew if a certain mood, then you were likely probably going to stay in your room so that you didn't become part of the ire that could await you if this person wasn't in that good of a mood, right? And so how does it show up for you now? Well, it shows up for you now because you are likely a person that wants others to understand where you're coming from. And so you might over explain. And so over explaining is a way to be like, I want you to trust me. And the reason that trust is really important to you is because at times you didn't know what you were going to walk into. You didn't know what environment was awaiting you. And so that makes it much more difficult to just go with the flow. You're constantly thinking, people don't believe me. People don't trust me. People think that I'm lying, and for me, like I have a lot of those inner doubts as well. I mean, I think in some ways it makes you self-conscious. I think it makes you feel like people might not trust you, or it also makes you feel there's a lot of guilt involved there too, because it's like, well, what could I have done better? What could I have helped her in some way? Could I have made things easier for her? You know? And so ultimately, we do the best that we can. So I just want to say, I think I'm going to start going live probably around like maybe 12:30 or so. So if you're interested in that, I think I'll probably drop a comment on YouTube so you can check that out as well. Again, thank you for your support. It means a lot to me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.